Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and I get the feeling this might wind up being a bit of a peculiar episode, given that I already covered two of the albums on the docket at length, and you should all go check out those solo reviews because I had a lot to say, and the albums are absolutely fantastic, but we'll get to that. No more wasting time. Let's get on the pulse. So we've got 8 projects on the docket, but let's cover some of those ones I already talked about, starting with, from Perfume Genius, Set My Heart on Fire Immediately. Oh, I was looking forward to this one. So much so that I wound up making an entire separate video exploring my lengthy thoughts on it. Again, I will say it doesn't quite hit the glorious highs of 2017's No Shape. There's some stylistic experimentation on that album that this can't quite touch, but I like the promise explored by Mike Hadrius' more outward-looking songwriting and contentedness that led to one of his most cohesive and frankly enjoyable projects to date. 9 out of 10, the highest of my recommendations. Folks, something beautiful. You ought to hear it. Next up, from Jason Isbell and the 400 Unit, Reunions.
Holding on chair, witches ring around the moon, better get home soon.
And on the topic of albums that I was so excited to hear and take in, I also did a separate review for this as well. A strikingly potent, unstable, alternative country project that is getting hit for being too political in a charged way, because apparently empathy is political now, who knew? Whatever, this is some stellar alternative country from one of the best singer-songwriters of the past decade. Light 9 out of 10, again, highest of my recommendations. You gotta hear this. Next up, from Emma Blackery, My Arms Are Open. So we actually got 2 EPs released by YouTube pop acts that I like more than the general public, so let's start off with the one I'd argue has a little bit less buzz. And I'd argue that Emma Blackery is a solid and nuanced songwriter, even if she can wear her influences a little too prominently in the execution. The most obvious for me being Churches and Taylor Swift. And if anything, that's more true here than on 2018's Villains, especially in her vocal affectations. Now, that's not a bad thing, but when the production remains pretty soft around the edges with its gentle beats and the ebbing swells of synth and even some light guitar, those influences come through even more starkly. But that being said, I still like her writing. The title of the EP is indicative of the looser themes, both in the challenge to her detractors to come at her, but also an expression of vulnerability and intimacy towards a potential new partner. And the subtle but love-struck History of Touches demo is a really pretty moment that captures the latter. Now, if anything, this feels even smaller and kind of safer than her last album, but given it's an EP, released at a time like this, yeah, you know what, still enjoyable, especially as you can tell in the production there's a lot more polish, so light 7 out of 10. But on a similar arc, from Gabbie Hanna, Bad Karma.
Are you sure you're ready for the fall? Out, throwing stones, I think you need to slow down. I can see right through you from my glass house, your glass house.
Talking about Gabbie Hanna on YouTube these days can be kind of awkward for me as a critic because it now comes with the ugly asterisk of her drama, which she's tried to shut down on an expansive and seemingly well-sourced video the evening before she released this, only to continue to make explicit references to it on the EP and in her music videos. I mean, if this was a plan to shut this down entirely and have the final word on what seems to be the arc of the EP, well, it went about as well as anyone would expect when you try to get the last word in the age of video responses and tabloid channels, so I'm not sure it goes away, but is the EP good in the meantime? Well, I think so. Yes and no. Gabbie's always positioned herself as a half step away from the drama when she's not an instigator, and yet a lot of it falls on her anyway, and she doesn't handle it all that well due to near omnipresent self-doubt and depression. It's why most of the EP could be framed as addressing herself as much as any potential target, but juxtaposed with some recent events, it does seem a little more coy and calculated than it really should, and that doesn't really help support her larger sympathies and the emotional emotional arc. Even if I do think her own questions of happiness on the final song, they're pretty sweet in how she eventually allows it for herself. That being said, as much as I like Gabbie Hanna's huskier voice, I do think this project feels a little rushed and slapdash at spots. Songs like Dandelion and Glass House seem to stop abruptly, in the latter case before it could really explode. Some of the vocal layering feels kind of inconsistent in accommodating for Gabbie's full vocal range. There's nothing here that's got the sheer impact of her best songs from the last album, and while this project feels more playful in both light and darkness, which can aid the melodrama, it's often at cross purposes to the heavier moments like Special, which doesn't help the overall tone for a pretty short project. But again, snapshot of a moment than a fully developed album, and I am looking forward to hearing more of that stylistic diversity and more robust tones that she did say was coming. So for what this is, extremely light 7 out of 10, mostly for her fans, but if you want to give her a chance, it's worth it. Next up from I'm Glad It's You, Every Sun, Every Moon.
I know it's not my fault, it's not your fault.
You know, if you're looking to kill my fondness for a trend in music, in this case Midwestern emo, the fast way to do it is keep on requesting albums that are so utterly milquetoast in the genre that I'm left without a lot to say. And yes, I know it's not entirely fair about I'm Glad It's You, as this sophomore album was inspired by the accidental death of their videographer, and I will say the sound has improved slightly from a very tepid and sloppily mixed debut. But here's a harsh truth that I've referenced before. Just referencing a personal tragedy in your content might win an initial moment of sympathy, but if it's not conveyed well, I'm not going to feel much of an emotional connection. And Kelly Bader is just not impressing me as a singer. He's opting for more restrained, sensitive, clean vocals that are certainly pretty, but his timbre and tone is not all that unique, and he's not placed in the mix in a way to accentuate his presence, which might have been the point if you're trying to accentuate homespun loneliness, but this album doesn't have much in the way of distinctive atmosphere to sell that beyond a very standard, very polished adult alternative / emo approach ripping off Death Cab for Cutie in 2006. Only with less interesting melodies. And that's where the additional female vocals slide in and kind of counterbalance all that isolated feel. I mean, I've got other complaints here too. The mixing of the guitar leads and cymbals is still messier than it should be when the production is otherwise this clean. A lot of the keyboards feel really oddly flat whenever they slide in. I keep waiting for a greater sense that I'm not convinced that their frontman can deliver that drama, but I think my biggest issue comes in the arc of the album, where nearly every song is confronting the grief, regret, and longing for closure that comes with dealing with death. Namely, that ultimately every story eventually circles back to our protagonist, and we get no greater detail about the person who actually died. Which, yes, of course, it's common. I get the emotional reality there, but when written in such broad generalities, this feels really myopic and thin. As a whole, I'm not going to say it's not pleasant. This will have an audience, but in going broad, there's just very little distinctive appeal, so light 5 out of 10. Not for me. Next up, from Paradise Lost, Obsidian. You ever hear those bands where you understand intellectually why they've got a cult following or an established legacy, but at the same time, you've got so little emotional resonance that there's still kind of a doubt in your mind? Yeah, that was my experience going through the back catalog of Paradise Lost, one of the most long-running and stable metal acts that have straddled classic metal, death metal, doom metal, and even some flashes of gothic synth pop around the turn of the millennium. They're over 30 years in, and I have heard their classic albums, and at best I think I get the appeal, but they're not for me. It's kind of frustrating, but I'd argue their poppier albums revealed my baseline problems with them beyond the fact that I just don't tend to like a lot of the gloomier side of doom metal. The hooks, they're not particularly gripping across albums that feel a lot longer than they are. The lyrics fall towards a lot of overdone cliches. The band's sound has occasionally felt a bit trend-chasing. And frontman Nick Holmes, well, let me just say I'm happy he's no longer doing that James Hetfield impression he was doing in the 90s. Now, in recent albums, they've trended towards darker, heavier, more grisly tones, which they've called going back to their roots, especially on their last album, Medusa. And it's hard not to feel like this is just a lot more of the same there. My point is that if you're a Paradise Lost fan, you're familiar with the sound, and this album is offering not that much in the way of surprises or great variation. The guitar work remains the greatest selling point off the fat, murky bass lines and the more developed drums, either with a chilly reverb or thicker crunch that doesn't have a ton of unique atmosphere or depth or smolder, but it can at least capture some of that downbeat mood effectively and deliver some good solos, especially when the strings slide in. But then I hit the roadblock of how relentlessly downbeat and dour the entire damn thing is, not counting the twinkling symphonic leaning passages where you'd think they'd try to have more fun given how silly they could sound. And this is where the fans will say, Mark, it's doom metal with a gothic twist, it's supposed to be depressing. But here's the thing, if I'm going for truly crushing downbeat metal, you'd expect the atmosphere to be more suffocating and isolating, but Paradise Lost lean on a lot of gleaming solos and the occasional hook, but not enough where they got the explosive classic metal intensity or catchiness. Now this places them at a really odd intersection point between subgenres, but not really picking up enough of their strengths for me, and the lyrics really don't help. An increasingly one-dimensional wallow in dreary nihilism with a pseudo-religious angle creeping around some of those tracks, and that wears out the welcome really fast, even if they're trying to be deconstructive with it. And look, you know what, if all this is your thing, I'm sure you're gonna find plenty that you'll like with this. Cuts like Serenity, Hear the Night, and The Devil Embrace, they do kinda stick with me, they're the standouts, but beyond that, light 6 out of 10, really just for the fans this late in their career, not for me. I've accepted that. Next up, from Charli XCX, How I'm Feeling Now.
You finally understand that maybe this feeling that I found might kill me. Put me in the ground.
Am I the only one who feels like we're getting a Charli XCX album earlier than I would expect? I mean, I guess she's always had a quick turnaround time, especially as she slid towards the PC music experimentation, but to have another homegrown project in the works was a little bit startling, even if the best way to consider it would be as a softer, less flashy contemporary to Charli from last year to match the current climate. And that's kind of what we got. Still a lot of the PC music production with the blaring, chrome-plated synths, the distorted vocals, and all the wonky mastering. It's not aiming for the same sort of glorious bombast, and as such, you're not gonna get a song as anthemic as Blame It On Your Love, but it is still just as splashy, futuristic, and grindingly technicolor. And once again, it feels like one of those albums that if I like the PC music approach to synth melodies and mastering, I'd probably get behind this a lot more, because a smaller focus does mean that more of these songs get to rely on a central melody and not blown out dance floor drops. And while I think an opportunity was kind of missed for Charli XCX to juxtapose organic expressiveness with all that flash, she is making her proto-e-girl presence all the more human, especially on this project where she's more bored, restless, missing her friends and family, looking for that party, and trying to find security with her boyfriend even as her own self-doubt rages again. And it's that uncertain humanity that gives the album its core and its best songs. But to repeat a lot of what I've said with Charli XCX in the past, my separation comes with not always getting on board with the PC music textures in the production. And the song that I like the most in this project, I finally understand, it was produced by Palmistry, who's only adjacent to that camp. I don't know, I've not yet been completely won over by a Charli XCX project yet, outside of snippets and isolated songs. And while I do hear melodic growth on this, and I get how well it fits the time and place, again, this will certainly have an audience, I'm just not quite there yet. Still, it's good. 7 out of 10. Check it out. And finally, from Future, High Off Life.
Popping new tags, it's 1/1. I got them chopsticks, sang on the lunch.
Here's the great benefit of a series like this. I can give Future about as much time as he deserves. A borderline postscript at the end of this video, cause what is there even left to say? There's no surprises, there's no visceral intensity, there's very little in the way of an interesting tune or atmosphere, most of which is buried behind the omnipresent trap skitter, and when it does show up, somehow Future picks some of the most awkward tumbling cascades or plucking squonks imaginable, and while I'd personally argue Future's been on autopilot the past couple of projects, Here it's just obvious and really unflattering. How in the Nine Hills is the percussion mixing getting worse with every separate album to sound even more flat and cheap, which doesn't match any of the opulence or brand names that he continues to brag about? I mean, the best thing I can say about this is that there's a couple guest appearances that sound okay. The Young Boy Never Broke Again interplay led to a decent hook, and you know what, for as stupid as All Bad is with Lil Uzi Vert, it's got energy, but outside of that, well, give me Up the River with its Rod Wave-esque piano line, which along with last name shows exactly how much he's jacking from that sound. And, I don't know, Posted with Demons for pure nihilistic trashiness. It's misogynist, but it kind of plays into it. Pitch the rest. Light 4 out of 10. You will forget this came out this year. Probably forget this came out this month, much like the last time. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I may have said a couple controversial things, covered some controversial acts here, or acts with devoted fan bases at least. But hey, comments are down there, have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to get involved in my schedule, I understand if you can't at this time, because tough times, I get it. But option over here is my Patreon. I'd be happy to have you guys come on board. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.